traveller had been walking for hours through the Scottish Highlands, beneath a pale sky where the clouds seemed to drag themselves along, as if even the wind had grown tired. The path, which at first had stood out among the heather and the damp grass, had gradually disappeared beneath moss and mist. Each step sank his boots into the soft peat, and the sound blended with the distant murmur of an unseen stream. He could not remember when he had left the last house behind, nor at what point the horizon had become an endless succession of green and grey hills, veiled in drizzle. He only knew he had to keep walking, even though the sun was already hiding behind the crags. The air smelled of wet earth, cold stone, and heather, and as he moved forward, a strange silence began to wrap around him. It was not complete silence, but the kind filled with muffled sounds, the brush of mist against his coat, the distant beat of his own heart, the wind moaning through the rocks like an ancient voice unwilling to be forgotten. That was when he heard it. At first, he thought it was only the wind playing through the valleys, but the sound had rhythm, a soft and ordered vibration, as though someone or something were singing a melody beneath the earth. He stopped. He listened again. The song was subtle, but unmistakably there, and it came from higher up, from a slope swallowed in fog. Cautiously, he began to climb. The hillside was slippery, the air colder with every step, but the music seemed to guide him. At times, the sound vanished entirely, only to return when the wind shifted direction, echoing among the rocks as though the stones themselves were whispering. When he finally reached the summit, the traveller found himself standing before a clearing. In the middle of the heather, surrounded by grass greener than seemed natural, stood 12 upright stones, covered in lichen and in runes so ancient they could barely be made out. The wind blew harder, and the stones began to sing. It was not a human melody. It was a deep, almost metallic resonance that trembled through the air and through the traveler's chest. Each stone seemed to release a different note, and together they formed a harmony that filled the clearing with an unsettling serenity. It was as if time itself had stopped to listen. The man remained there, motionless, watching the mist swirl between the monoliths. For a moment he thought he could make out shadows moving behind them, slender figures like smoke, fading each time the wind changed. "Who is singing there?" he asked, without expecting an answer. The melody rose slightly, as if the air replied with a sigh. Then he felt a strange urge, not to run, but to draw closer. He pulled off his gloves, and when he laid his palm against one of the stones, he found it warm despite the cold. Its surface trembled gently, as though it were breathing. And then, for an instant, an image formed in his mind. A lake under the moon, a circle of women dressed in pale robes, and a melody rising from the water. Then the wind shifted, and the vision dissolved. The traveller stepped back, startled. The stone returned to silence, but the others kept singing. He looked around. There were no signs of life, no paths, no ruins, nothing that might explain what he was seeing. And yet, in the center of the circle, the grass was flattened, as though someone had been standing there not long before. He walked toward the center. As he did, the air seemed to grow denser. The mist whirled around him, and the sensation of being watched settled over him like an invisible weight. Not in a threatening way, but with an ancient, patient expectancy, as if the place itself were waiting for something from him. The wind blew again, softer this time. The the song of the stones changed tone. The notes grew slower, deeper. A low vibration ran through the ground, and the traveler felt the cold suddenly fall away. Then he saw it. In the fog before him, a figure took shape. It had no clear outline. It was like moonlight reflected on water. A voice emerged from the air, gentle and sorrowful at once. It has been centuries since anyone crossed this circle. The traveler took a step back, but the figure raised a transparent hand. Do not be afraid. This place knows no malice. The wind swirled again, and the voice became clearer. Are you the one who hears our song? The man nodded slowly. I only heard it by chance, he replied. I was lost. No one arrives here by chance, said the voice, and the stones vibrated softly, as if confirming the words. The traveler looked around, feeling how the air in the clearing held a faint shimmer, almost imperceptible, as if the veil of another world were brushing against his own. Who are you? He asked quietly. The figure seemed to incline its head. I was the guardian of this circle, when men still spoke with the wind, when every stone had a name and a purpose. Now only we remain, the voices of time, waiting for someone to remember. A chill ran down the traveler's spine. What are you waiting for? For someone to listen without fear, the voice whispered. For someone to remember that mountains dream as well. The wind rose once more. The stones began a new melody, brighter now, sweeter. For a moment the traveler felt the world turning slowly, felt everything he had forgotten, the roads, his weariness, his loneliness, dissolve into that song. And in that instant he understood that the circle was not merely a ring of ancient stones, but a doorway, not to a physical place, but to a memory that was still alive among the grass and the mist. The song faded little by little, until it became only a murmur. The traveler closed his eyes. The voice spoke again, barely audible. Listen carefully, traveler. Every wind carries a memory. If you know how to hear it, you will never truly be lost. Then silence returned. When he opened his eyes, the figure had vanished. The wind blew calmly, and the stones no longer sang. The traveler drew a deep breath. The air was warmer now, and the sky, once gray, was beginning to open in a pink strip to the west. He did not know how much time had passed there, but a sense of peace wrapped around him. He looked once more at the circle, and with slow steps began to descend the hill. Behind him, the wind blew again, very faintly, but enough for the stones to release one last note, like a farewell. The descent was gentler than the climb. Or perhaps it was he who, after that encounter, was walking differently. The weight on his shoulders had grown lighter, as though each step left behind a layer of weariness he had never known how to name. The mist still settled on his skin, but it no longer buffeted him. It wrapped around him like a light blanket, thin enough to see through in small openings where the landscape widened like a sigh. The traveler, that still nameless man in a worn coat, carrying a folded map more out of habit than usefulness, followed the discreet line of a stream born among the rocks. The ribbon of water ran clear, murmuring delicately, and smelled of fresh stone and roots. Every so often he stopped to listen, wondering whether the song of the stones might still reach him from above. But only the common rustle of the wind came through. Even so, he could have sworn that in that murmur, some echo remained. One lingering note his chest recognized as its own. He followed the course of the water. He came upon a peat bridge, little more than a few old planks, and on the other side, stood a small stone building with a slate roof. It was a bothy, a refuge for walkers. Moss had colonized the walls, and the door creaked when he pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of old smoke and wool, as though the last fire had been put out the previous night, though a fine layer of dust denied the possibility. Even so, the place felt welcoming, honest in its bareness. He set his pack against the wall. There was a wooden table scarred by knife marks, a bench, and a stone hearth with a handful of dry splinters. In one corner hung a bundle of heather, almost without scent now, and a dented kettle waited patiently nearby. Without realizing it, the traveler smiled. The simple routine of making a fire and putting water on to boil gave him back an ordinary kind of normalcy, like a song the hands remember on their own. The flame came to life shyly, coaxed with care. When the water began to boil, soft steam filled the bothy, and the warmth eased the stiffness in his fingers. He drank a pale tea, accompanied only by the beating heart of the fire and the crackling of embers. Outside, the wind had settled, but in the chimney something sometimes trembled, like a memory of the song. It was only a line, a brief and cheerful vibration, as though the stone still carried the music inside it. He settled onto the bench, behind which a rough blanket promised rest. He closed his eye for a moment. His body asked for sleep, but his mind drifted among images. It was not unrest. It was the gentle motion of a lake beneath the moon. Sometimes, in the flicker of that dreamlike landscape, women appeared, moving in silence, their robes seeming to drink the light. They did not speak. They did not sing either. They simply walked around a stone circle like his, with ancient patience. The traveler breathed slowly and let the images soften. His heart matched the rhythm of the fire. Outside, something moved in the grass. It was not his place to know whether it was a curious fox or an old deer. He imagined kind eyes watching the bothy, and the thought gave him peace. He wished that every creature crossing that hill on that rainy night would be safe. That simple intention seemed to warm the air a little more. He slept without disturbance, and in his sleep he heard the wind change direction, not like a blow, but like the soft turn of a hand. The stones sang again, and the sound seemed closer this time. He woke as pale dawn slipped through the ill-fitted door. Outside, the world was a bowl filled with mist and white light. The fine rain had washed the colors clean, leaving them fresh and clear like laundry hung out to dry. He rose slowly. He made another tea. He loosened his shoulders in a long stretch. He looked at his boots by the door. They were damp but sound, with little bits of heather clinging to the soles. He thought of the map. He knew that if he unfolded it, he would not find the bothy or the stone circle marked there. Some places do not accept coordinates as names. They prefer that one arrive with an ear turned toward the earth. He stepped outside. The air smelled of sheep and peat, and a line of birds was crossing the sky toward the east. He did not really know where he should go next, but it did not trouble him. Something inside him trusted the thread of water, or the edge of a hill, or the shadow of a birch tree. He set off at an easy pace, without imagining himself master of the rhythm. The heather brushed against his trousers with tenderness, as if it recognized in that foreign skin a story that belonged to it as well. The stream widened, then narrowed again. He leaned over a pool. The water held the reflection of a torn cloud, and on its surface, a perfect circle, revealed the fall of a single drop. He knelt and drank from cupped hands. The water tasted of sweet iron and something else as well, perhaps a word without letters, slipping down his throat. He followed the valley until the rocks, like great sleeping sheep, dotted the landscape with whimsical forms. One of those boulders looked like a sofa. A fallen trunk rested against its back, and he decided to sit for a while. From there, if he turned his body at just the right angle, he could catch sight of the upper line of the hill where he had found the circle. The stones themselves were not visible, but the profile of the summit seemed sharper now, as if the wind had combed the mist aside for him. The blanket of clouds had not yet fully broken. Through one opening passed a shaft of light that touched one spot on the slope with a musician's precision. The traveler held his breath. It was like a finger from the sky, pointing to a note. And at the same time, the landscape around him began to sound. Not with an audible noise, but with resonance. He felt it in his skin, in his nails. The music of the hill pulsed in silence, and he found that beautiful. He thought of going back to the circle, not out of curiosity, more out of courtesy. He had walked on land that had welcomed him without question, and he had been invited to listen. It felt right to return, to greet it again, and to learn a little more about the winds, their directions, and their voices. He began the climb without haste. The breeze touched the back of his neck with care. He had the feeling that if he spoke aloud, his words would remain floating among the ferns like dragonflies. He did not judge the idea strange. He simply let it be, the way one leaves a bird perched on a fence. When he reached the plateau, he found the clearing lying quiet at his feet. The stones stood still, with no glow and nothing to reveal their song. Yet the grass in the center remained slightly flattened, as though the previous night had hosted some discreet gathering of shadows. He approached slowly and stopped beside the stone where, the afternoon before, he had felt warmth beneath his palm. He touched it again, cold, hard, but not foreign. He drew a deep breath, closed his eyes, waited. There was no apparition, no voice, only the wind, settling very gently around him. The traveler let his exhale lengthen. He told himself, without stiffness, that he would remain there for a while, as one visits a friend. A while in which he needed nothing except to be there. He sat in the grass, rested his back against the stone, listened. At first, his own thoughts pecked at him like nervous birds. What would he do next? Where would he sleep that night? Should he try to cross that valley to the west? Should he return to the bothy? The questions loosened on their own, like laces without knots. His breathing slowed. The smell of heather deepened. A small insect walked over his boot, climbed partway up, then came back down at leisure, as if it had changed its mind. Then the wind shifted. It was a small turn, almost a gesture. It came from the northwest, cold, carrying the taste of freshly washed stone. The stones did not sing at once, but the traveler felt a vibration in his back. A low note, almost a hum, rose from within the rock until it mingled with his own chest. Then a second stone answered in a higher tone, fine as a silver thread. The third joined in with a rounded, generous sound. Within a few heartbeats, the circle had composed a slow melody full of wide spaces. The man did not move. There was no need. The music wrapped around him without asking anything of him. The wind rose and fell, and with every variation, the whole arrangement changed color. Not in pitch, but in density, like woven fabric. Within that fabric, the traveler felt that he could stretch out his hand and touch a memory. When he did, an image appeared before him. A peat path crossed by an old man wrapped in wool, carrying a sheep over one shoulder. The old man smiled, not at the traveler. He smiled at the hill itself, as if every step were a greeting. Another gust, another note. He saw a boat on a dark lake. A woman with her hair pinned back was singing without a voice, swaying gently from side to side as if rocking the night to sleep. The shore was far away. The water was deep. And yet there was no danger. There was trust and a secret rhythm of oars in the water. The vision dissolved, and in its place appeared a stone room, a loom, a little girl asleep at her mother's feet, wrapped in a tartan blanket. The mother paused the shuttle now and then to look through the window toward the hill, and she seemed to be listening. Time slowed. The traveler understood that these were not scenes to decode, nor stories to retell exactly as they came. They were signs. They were strokes of the past that did not impose a rigid lesson, but offered companionship instead. As if the winds held in their depths pieces of lives the earth had adopted as its own. He closed his eyes serenely. A tear, free of sadness, crossed his cheek. He let himself rest in that vast, borderless tenderness. Around him, one or two birds began to chirp timidly, as though they too were trying out the proper note. A cloud drifted by, and its shadow turned slowly over the monoliths. The traveler thought then that he was not truly alone, that sometimes in places like this, the boundaries between visible and invisible company soften, and that even when there are no figures, there are presences like mist. They do not cling, they do not demand, they simply are. When the wind stopped, the melody unraveled into silence, like a thread slipping free from a needle. Grass became grass again. Stone, stone. And yet, something had changed. He could not say what. It was a fine adjustment, like a string no longer stretched too tight, tuning itself to another. He rose to his feet, stretched his back, looked toward the horizon. A strip of pale light had opened to the south, like a soft road. "Thank you," he said, without knowing to whom. The air answered with a feather of breeze that brushed his hair back. It was enough. He smiled. He walked down the hill with steady steps, not because he had a plan, but because he felt, in the soles of his feet, that the ground recognized him. The afternoon moved forward like the blade of a slow knife, slicing the mist into thin layers. In the valley, he found a clearer path, marked by old sheep tracks. To one side stood a low stone house with a thatched roof, a modest croft with a patch of cabbages and turnips beside it. An old dog, gray-coated and soft-eyed, pricked up, its ears when it saw him, but did not bark. The animal's movement was more a question than a warning. The door opened, and a woman appeared, her skin weathered by the climate, and a scarf tied around her head. Her eyes, though, were a startling young green, in a face that knew winter well. She watched him for a few seconds, as one measures the distance between two stories, and held the silence with a calm that soothed. "You'll be cold," she said at last, more as a fact than an invitation. The traveler nodded. She stepped aside and tipped her head. He entered, ducking slightly so as not to brush the lintel. Inside it smelled of freshly baked oat bread, damp wool, and plain soup. A lively fire burned in the hearth, and a pot hung from its hook. The woman, without hurry, offered him a deep bowl. He held it in both hands. The steam warmed his face, his nose, and the space behind his eyes. It tasted of potato, barley, and something green. His body gave thanks with the gratitude of bone. "My name is Morag," the woman said, leaning an elbow on the table. "And yours?" The traveler hesitated for a second. Not because he had no name, but because being named there felt intimate. He chose one his mother had once used when speaking softly to him, as though it were a secret shared only between them. "Ewan." Morag nodded. The dog, stretched beside the hearth, thumped its tail against the floor twice, as though saying welcome in its own language. The woman pointed to a tin cup. "Roasted barley. It warms you. The wind carries dampness these days." They ate and drank with long pauses between. Morag asked without intruding. Ewan answered with just enough. "Lost, yes. Following the ghost of a path no longer found on maps, perhaps." "A circle of stones," he said at last, and Morag's eyes lit in a particular way. "The singers of the mist," she whispered, as though mentioning old neighbor women sleeping on the far side of the hill. "Not many hear them. Not many hear them anymore." Ewan lowered his gaze for a moment, like someone confirming something he had barely dared believe. Morag rose and went to a shelf. She returned with a small cloth pouch tied with string. She opened it. Inside were little pieces of sea glass, smoothed by salt and thyme, glinting shyly. She spilled them carefully onto the table one by one, forming a clumsy circle. "My grandmother used to say the stones sing when the wind brings memories. But the memories are not only of people. They belong to water too, to birds, to sheep, even to moss. And when someone listens, it is not to learn things. It is to sit with them for a while, the way you sit beside an old woman weaving and simply keep her company." Ewan picked up one of the glass pieces. It was green, with an edge that fit neatly against his fingertip. He held it to the light. The fire passed through it, and for a second the glass looked like a tiny lake. Morag watched him with approval, not with a broad smile, but with a softness in her face, deeper than any gesture. "My grandmother also said that in the first song, the stones remind you that you are not alone. In the second, they show you a door. And in the third, they ask whether you want to cross it." Ewan felt a small stirring in his stomach. It was not unease. It was the sweet recognition of a promise still far away. He set the piece of glass down carefully. "I don't know if I'm ready for a door," he said, almost in a whisper. "No one ever is," Morag replied gently. "That is why the door only appears when it no longer matters. When being on one side or the other becomes the same thing, then crossing is no longer crossing. It is breathing." The dog, perhaps tired of human philosophy, shook itself and changed sides. The rain tapped more softly at the roof. Morag rose and pulled a round loaf from the oven. The smell spread and filled every corner. Then she pointed toward the back door. "If you stay the night, there's a cot in the barn. The dogs don't snore, and the sheep only do if they dream they're wolves. It doesn't happen often." It was a small joke, spoken in a low voice, and it drew a real smile from Ewan, one that reached his eyes and made them shine. He thanked her. In return, he offered to help with whatever needed doing. Morag raised an eyebrow, as though she did not believe much in strict bargains, but she nodded toward a pile of cut peat waiting to be stacked. They worked outside for a while, beneath rain growing finer by the minute. The peat was stacked in blocks. Ewan's hands darkened with it. His skin, though, felt clean. The repeated motion of lifting and placing gave him a new calm. as if each piece were finding its proper place, both outside and within him. Morag did not speak much, except to indicate with her chin where the weight should go. The afternoon slowly surrendered its light, and the sky took on the color of sheep. At last, they left the work for later, for tomorrow, or for whenever the wind should say. They ate soup again, along with the fresh bread. Morag told a few stories of her grandmother in short sentences. A bothen on the hill, a snowy night when the stones sang without wind, as though the world itself had exhaled through them. A fox approaching without fear, sitting like a guest, ears pricked toward a music it already knew. Ewan listened with the reverence one gives a river. He felt both full and light at once. When the dog yawned with a long little complaint, Morag pointed him toward the barn. He crossed the threshold with a blanket over his shoulder. The smell of hay received him like an old embrace. He lay down on the cot, and above him the wooden roof, lined with cracks through which small pieces of sky could be seen, showed him a new constellation, stars of wind. Every gap was an eye through which the breeze leaned in to look. He closed his eyes, and in the stillness, he suddenly felt the echo, barely perceptible, of the stones far away. It was not a full song, only the memory of a note, and it was enough. He smiled, and sleep covered him slowly, like a patient loom. He woke before dawn. The house was asleep. The dog, curled into itself, moved only one ear. Ewan slipped out quietly. The air was still, as though waiting for a sign. He walked toward the hill with Cloud's soft steps. He did not want to miss the first light. He reached the clearing just as a pink line began to draw itself along the edge of the world. He stopped beside the stone he already recognized, laid his hand there, here, breathed. The wind, this time, came from the east, warm, with a faint scent of smoke and bread. The first stone sang in a middle tone, long and sustained, like the deep, kind drone of bagpipes. The others answered in harmony. Ewan closed his eyes and let the tone pass through his brow. He saw with calm clarity an old man sitting on a dry stone wall, playing a simple flute. The melody was in no hurry. The man's fingers moved with an exactness that sought not perfection, but presence. The scene dissolved into a field of barley bending in the wind, where a young woman walked with one hand outstretched, brushing the grain heads. Ewan felt the texture of that touch in his own fingertips, a tingling, a caress. The song rose slightly, and a cliff appeared, and far below it, the sea. Salt entered his nose despite not being there. His breathing widened, grew round. Then a voice, soft as the first time, emerged. No figure appeared, only the voice, anchored in the air. You came back. Ewan did not reply at once, not because he lacked words, but because of the delicate fear of breaking something precious with noise. He nodded, though perhaps the voice had no need of gestures. You invited me to listen, he said at last. That is why I'm here. And you do listen, the air whispered. That is enough. The song sharpened slightly, as if the circle were tuning its strings for his ear. And the voice went on, not with instructions, but with small stories, like crumbs marking a path one is under no obligation to follow. Each stone holds a story. It is not its own. It is not yours. It belongs to whoever needed it and left it here. You may sit beside each one and breathe in what it carries. One will bring you sheep, another oars, a third the laughter of a child, another snow. If you visit all 12, you will not know more, but you will be more here." Ewan smiled. He liked the promise that did not behave like one. He liked the word here. It was simple and at the same time inexhaustible. "And what is yours?" he asked, not so much from curiosity as from a desire to continue the conversation. The voice did not hurry. "I belong to thread," it replied, and within that word there were many others. To cloth, to hands, to eyes that understand the hidden pattern that appears when the loom sings. I belong to salt and wool, to winter and bread. I was not one, I was many. We are many. I am those who listen. I am those who remember. And now I am one more wind, passing through your ribs. Ewan felt it passing through. It was not a shiver. It was like windows opening. The breeze entered in a circle, sweeping out old dust. He inhaled, exhaled. "Then come when the west wind blows," said the voice, like someone suggesting tea on some later afternoon. "The stones will play a song of water that I love." The light was growing. The song slowed, like a boat reaching shore on a sweet drift of momentum. Ewan opened his eyes. The clearing glowed a little, though perhaps it was only dawn. He looked at the stones one by one and asked their permission with his eyes to return. "See you soon," he said, and the wind toyed with his scarf like a child saying goodbye. He walked down with a slow heart. The world below had awakened. A flock, like a grey game board, moved from one side to the other. A young man in a cap, broad-handed, was whistling truces to a lively dog running in waves. Ewan raised a hand. The young man answered with a tilt of his chin. Nothing more. It was already much. He returned to the croft. Morag, slicing bread, looked up as he entered and asked nothing. She served him a piece with butter and a little honey. She set it in his hand, the way one gives an amulet. He bit into it and felt sunlight on his palate. Sometimes sunlight arrives that way, by mouth. "There are things you tell and things you keep," said Morag, not as a rule, but as a caress. "You don't need to decide which is which yet." Ewan nodded. The dog, between them, had already drifted back to sleep. Smoke rose from the chimney in one straight line into the sky. That afternoon, the wind turned west. Obedient to a rotation, the hill kept more faithfully than any clock. Morag announced it without words. She placed a sprig of heather on the windowsill and set beside it a bowl of water. Ewan watched her and understood. He already knew that if he climbed, the water would have a part to play in the song. He took a different route to widen the boundaries of his inner map. He passed a solitary birch, its white bark scarred by age, softly clicking as if in conversation with the air. His feet, now mostly dry, found steady ground in the tall grass. The sky had cleared, leaving a strip of pale blue where a stray gull was flying inland, perhaps warned by the message of the wind. As he approached, he caught a salty scent that could not possibly belong to the hill. It was as if the sea had climbed upward through the invisible channels of the air. The circle, when it received him, seemed clearer now. Under the shy sunlight, the stones showed different veins. Some had little white lines like roads. Others bore marks of rust-red iron, like extinguished flames. He laid his hand on the one that had become his favorite companion and let his body settle into the afternoon's tone. The west arrived with a first long breath. The song of the stones woke from the ground upward. The low notes came first, round and patient, like a sea that knows every shore. Then a narrower stone gave off a high tone that suggested droplets falling in a cave. A fifth, flatter one added a steady undertone, a whisper that recalled a pebble beach where the water speaks with every stone. Ewan closed his eyes. He did not seek images. He let them come however they wished. The first was a wooden pier on a loch. A man stood there with his hands in his pockets, waiting for a boat without haste. The water was so dark, it drank the sky. The man whistled something that was not quite a song, but close. Then came an island covered in pines, with a tiny hermitage on it. A face he could not clearly see, calm-eyed, moved in and out of the doorway. There was no tense mystery there, only an easy back and forth, as if testing whether the evening had turned cold. The smell of salt deepened, and Ewan felt on his lips the taste of a day by the sea. A memory he did not know the source of touched his tongue. A kiss in the wind, the faint laughter of lost friends, a piece of bread with herring eaten on a rock. There was spaciousness in that western song. There were farewells that did not hurt. There were returns without slammed doors. A discreet figure, hardly more than a density in the air, appeared at his side. It had no contours, but its presence warmed the place a little. The voice, the same voice, spoke with restrained joy, as if it too delighted in this melody. "This is how my sister sang when the sea drew a deep breath," it whispered. "On days like these, sailboats did not need to shout at the waves. It was enough to call them by their names." Ewan didn't ask what those names were. He sought no dictionary of water. He let the idea of naming remain suspended in the air. The voice lowered slightly, as though settling into an invisible chair. "Do you know why these stones sing?" The traveler opened his mouth, then closed it again. The question deserved silence first. "Because they are hollow," he ventured with a shy smile, accepting his own ignorance. The breeze laughed. It was such a slight sound it might have passed for a leaf, had not his heart recognized it. "They are full," the voice corrected, "of channels of time, of lines of wind crossing like underground rivers. They are stone trees. Their sap is air. And when the air is exactly right, they sing the way birches sing in winter, though no one hears them." Ewan let the image settle in his chest. Stone trees, wind as sap. Yes. The metaphor suited them. With gentle curiosity, he noticed a crack running from the base to halfway up one of the monoliths. He bent down, slipped the tip of his finger just inside, as one touches the edge of an old book. He felt an immediate coolness, and beneath it, something like a caress, as if a blade of grass had licked his fingerprint. "There is no hurry," the voice continued. "You can come with every wind, learn their flavors, their stories. The north brings bone, the south fruit, the east bread, the west water, and in between there are the small winds, the ones the old people called by names that barely remain on the tongue." "And if one day nothing blows?" Ewan asked, not fearfully, but with the kind of interest that feels like closing one's eyes to better feel the sun. "Then you breathe for them," said the voice, "and the circle sings very softly, only for your ears." The traveler smiled. It was a fair arrangement. He lay down in the grass, not fully, but half turned to one side, with his head resting against a lower stone. From that angle, the sky was a slow wheel. A hawk traced wide circles without the urgency of hunting. Insects drifted in the air. Some buzzing brushed his ear, and after a brief pause, moved away again without troubling him. When the song lowered in volume, Ewan sat up again. He noticed something in the center of the circle. A small round stone he had not seen before, not because it had not been there, but because the grass had hidden it. He picked it up. Its surface was smooth, marked with a natural pattern that looked like a whirlpool. He held it on his open palm. It was not an object, he knew at once. It was company. He slipped it into his pocket, not to keep it, but to let it accompany him for a short while. Morag would know what to say. The afternoon stretched on. Ewan returned while the light was still kind. Morag was sitting on the bench outside, a cup in her hands, watching the dog chew a stick with grave concentration. When she saw the stone in Ewan's hands, she raised an eyebrow. "You've brought back a wheel of water," she said, renaming it in her own way. Ewan offered it to her so she could look at it. Morag held it for a moment, closed her eyes, smiled faintly, and placed it back into his hand. "Keep it today. Return it tomorrow. Offer heather with it. Simple things work." There was no ritual beyond those gestures. That simplicity was its own protection. They ate together that evening. Between bites, Morag told stories about winds, that the summer Gaoth tastes of blueberry on warm nights, that the Tuath wind carries on its tongue the footsteps of old deer, that the wind of the Bialach, the one that slips through the pass between two mountains, has a whistle only those who have cried can hear. Ewan listened as one listens to a catalogue of stars one may never see, and yet is happy to know exist. That night his sleep was deep. The stone in his pocket beat softly like a second heart. It did not weigh anything. It was a little cold sun. The next morning dawned with a north wind. There was no harshness in it. It was crisp. It cleared things. It stung the tip of the nose just a little. Morag wrapped a thick scarf around him without asking, and rubbed his shoulders the way mothers do before sending children out to play. Ewan climbed knowing that in that wind the stories would smell of snow. And so they did. The stones sang in long sighs that called to mind ice under sunlight. Ewan saw a peat hut half covered over, with a white roof. Two silhouettes moving inside, warmed by a fire barely visible through the chimney. A mother bathed a baby in a wooden bowl with quick, delicate hands. There was no hurry in anything. There was the long winter afternoon. The sight filled his eyes with water that was not tears, but brightness. The north also brought him the story of a great stag, walking among stones with antlers crowned in light. It was not a king, it was an elder who had learned every path without a map, who knew where the ground gave way and where one must turn back. Ewan bowed his head to that figure in respect, as one greets someone who shows the way without speaking. The voice, that wind full of memory, stayed near without saying much. Sometimes a yes, sometimes a listen here, sometimes nothing. And in that nothing, Ewan understood things that had no need of words. That afternoon, when the wind softened and turned southwest, he returned the stone to the center of the circle. He did not simply place it there. He cut a small branch of heather with his knife, laid it on top, and pressed the earth lightly with his fingers, as one seals a letter with care. "Thank you," he said with his hand. The stones answered in a murmur almost too faint to hear. He returned to Morag's house, feeling something close to home. He was not an inhabitant, yet he felt like one. A guest who already knows where the cups are kept, and which spoon is the favorite for sugar. The woman smiled when she saw him enter, flower on her cheek. The dog, solemn as an old man, allowed Ewan to scratch behind its ear with indecorous satisfaction. "Tomorrow," Morag said, looking through the window at a sky the day had left clean. "If the night wants it, there will be dances in the stones. It is the eve when the winds greet one another." Ewan inclined his head. He felt a small emotion move inside him, like a very still fish suddenly deciding to swim. "They are not dances to be seen," the woman added, with no wish to disappoint. "They are dances to be heard from within, like when you close your eyes and feel rain on the roof. You know how it falls, even if you do not see it." Ewan took the cup Morag was offering. He drank. The liquid was sweet only as much as it needed to be. Morag pressed his forearm with her fingers, a short, warm gesture, and released him at once. "Sleep. Tomorrow is long." The eve arrived under a cotton sky, brushed only lightly with blue. The wind, undecided, tested directions the way a child touches every key before choosing a melody. Ewan climbed at dawn, his body light, his brow open. Morag stayed behind, busy with wool and bread, or perhaps consciously granting him the privacy of his own listening. The dog accompanied him halfway up the slope, and at a point known only to itself, turned back and returned with the gait of ritual. In the clearing, the air had the density of broad things. Ewan sat without hurry. He did not place his hand on the stone at once. He simply looked. The light fell on each monolith at a precise angle, as if some ancient piper had marked their places with shadow. Golden motes filled the air. They were not particles visible in any ordinary way, and yet they could be felt on the skin as they passed, like tiny kisses. The first wind, almost imperceptible, came from the south. It carried the scent of stored apples, golden wood, dry wool. The stones answered with an open song, a melody without edges, where the notes held like still pools. Ewan let the sound fill his mouth. He felt the urge to smile for no reason at all. Into his mind came the image of an old kitchen, with a bench by the fire, and hands peeling potatoes with a small knife. The music of the South is harvest, he thought. A filled pantry. Short stories told by the fire, beside a glass of milk. The second wind came from the east, clear and pure, touched with the smell of fresh bread. The stones did not shift abruptly. They introduced a new line, a fine note slipping among the others with a tenderness that moved him. Ewan remembered a dawn somewhere else, perhaps in childhood, when a rooster crowed behind a stone wall. The memory was not exact, but it carried the clarity of freshly washed eyes. The east, he knew then, his promise. The third came from the west, forever burdened with the sea, and the melody took on the body of water. Ewan saw nothing definite. He felt the palms of his hands grow damp, as though he had held them near a spring. The fourth, from the north, brought kindly hardness, an invisible structure, a pattern one could rest upon, like a loom stretched out, supporting threads without pulling them too tight. And between those four, the smaller winds offered themselves a turn. A northwest wind that smelled of boat tar and the wet back of a dog. A southeast one carrying the fragrance of a hidden flower. A north-northeast bringing news of living rock. A south-southwest that sounded like distant laughter. Ewan breathed in with each of them, breathed out with each of them. And suddenly his breathing became a bridge. He knew it with quiet certainty. The bridge between the music and himself stretched from his ribs to his mouth, and from his mouth to the stones. They crossed it without effort. From the side of the stone, from that side, it must look like a man sitting there breathing with the world, he thought, and the idea filled him with peace. The voice came then, slowly. like a bare foot on grass. "Today, it is enough for us to be," it said. "There is nothing to understand." Ewan nodded. He liked the idea that there could be days without any task list. Days when the hill demanded nothing but presence. He had lived too long with lists, with routes, with goals. Sometimes they had been useful. Other times they had only been noise. "We will tell you something," the voice added, as if settling onto the edge of a secret without weight. "It is not a story to frighten. It is a story to lull." Ewan closed his eyes with gentle care, as though his eyelids were delicate leaves. He listened. The voice spoke not in long sentences, but in breaths. There was a time when the stones did not sing. They were mute, proud. They listened only to weight, never to wind. Then a woman came, one who spun in silence. She placed her fingers on the stone, and in the same way one listens to wool before weaving it, she listened to the rock. She taught it to breathe through its cracks. It was not magic in the way stories tell it. It was the patience of years. She sat there every afternoon, in winter, in summer, in spring, in autumn. At last, one day, the wind passing overhead felt invited. It descended, slipped inside, and the stone, for the first time, sang. At first it was a groan, then a note, then a melody. That is how it began. Ewan received the story as one receives a blanket laid across the shoulders unexpectedly, and is grateful for it all the same. He felt, without needing to see her, that woman with wise fingers. In his mind he wanted to give her a name, but none came. She did not seem to need one. She was the weaver of breaths. That was enough. "Since then," the voice continued, sounding lower now, as if speaking from within his chest, "every person who comes and sits leaves behind a thread. It cannot be seen, but it remains, and the winds take it, carry it, bring it back. That is why, when you come, you do not only hear us, you hear yourself interwoven with others, and if you stay long enough, your thread grows truer." Ewan did not know whether his own thread had grown true. He did know that it was becoming so, and that ongoing becoming seemed more beautiful to him than any completed perfection. He kept breathing. The music swelled slightly, as if expanding toward the edge of the clearing. He imagined, with affection, that the sheep could hear it too, and that perhaps this was why they sometimes looked upward, for no visible reason. Time passed without passing. The afternoon settled on his shoulders. The sun devoted one long ray to a single stone, as if choosing it for a solo. Ewan remained there until the light turned the color of old wool. When he rose, his body did not creak. It was loose, as after a good bath. As he walked down, he thought of Morag, of her bread, of the dog, of the warmth of the cup in his hands, of how, without realizing it, they had woven a small family for a handful of days. The thought moved him without hurting him. He tucked it away, as one tucks a lullaby into a pocket, to hear later in a train station. That night, the house was warm. Morag's eyes shone. Ewan told her, though without detail, what he had felt. She nodded without asking for more. "There are things the tongue phrase," she said, with a truth Ewan had no need to test. Then, almost absently, she opened a drawer and took out a small linen handkerchief embroidered with a simple design. 12 stones, and in the center, a spiral. She placed it in Ewan's hand. "So you can wipe your forehead if the songs make you sweat," she joked in her dry way. "And so you remember to loosen your brow whenever things become too beautiful." They laughed. They ate. They sat for a while in silence. The dog dreamed and moved its paws, as if chasing melodies across a field. Dawn came softly, without hurry. Ewan woke with the sense that something, not urgent, was calling him. It was not a voice. It was a gentle tug at his shirt. He rose. Outside, the first birds were testing syllables. Morag was asleep. He left no note. It was unnecessary. He climbed for the last time in that sequence of days. He knew there would be others. But this one smelled of closure, of a knot that does not tighten. In the circle, the light was a sheet spread by invisible hands. The stones, motionless, seemed to be waiting. Ewan stood in the center, not from any hero's impulse, but because his body asked for that place, the way one chooses without thinking the chair one always sits in. The first wind that came was barely a thought. It had no direction, or else it had all of them. It carried, as though in a bowl, little pieces of the winds of earlier days. The south and its bread, the west and its water, the north and its bone, the east and its promise. The stones, together, released a note that was all four at once. Ewan felt it touch the crown of his head, travel down his throat, open a drawer in his sternum, and come to rest in his belly. His body became an instrument, tuned by a will both his own and not his own. The voice came, not alone, not separate. It was the voice of many woven together. Its timbre was collective, like a soft choir. "You have been," they said. "You have listened. If you leave with us. If you stay with us. It is the same. You are. That is what matters." Ewan, eyes still closed, felt tears gather. Not from nostalgia, from gratitude. The muscles of his face loosened just as Morag had advised. He let that pulling sensation become a current under the skin. The circle seemed to move, not by turning, but by floating ever so slightly. The stones sang louder, but it did not hurt. It was exactly the right volume, like when the tide rises and, for a little while, the whole world is sea. The visions appeared and did not linger. A hand letting go of another with tenderness in a station. An autumn path carpeted in leaves. A house with mother in it. A letter never sent that somehow arrived anyway. They were not his, and they were his. They belonged to everyone. They belonged to no one. And the music, to each image, said yes. That yes was the permission so many muscles had been asking for all those years. The voice, very close to his ear, whispered, "When you are far away and cannot hear us, look, for the hollow in your chest, where the wind tangles. Blow there, we will answer." Ewan inhaled, exhaled. Something that had been a fine knot came undone. It did not leave him. It changed. It was thread now. One more thread in the hill's silent warp. He knew it with a certainty that does not need proclaiming. He knew it, and that was all. The melody lowered. The wind distributed itself among the stones like bread divided, so that it is enough for all. Ewan opened his eyes. The light was full, yet soft. He said, almost under his breath, "Thank you." The stones did not say you're welcome. No formal words were needed. Even so, one of them released a note so small only he could hear it. It was its way of touching his shoulder. He smiled. He walked down the slope like someone trying not to make noise with his feet. At the croft, Morag was waiting with 2 cups of roasted barley. She did not ask anything. She put one into his hand. Then she touched his forehead with the back of her own hand, the way mothers do, to see whether he had a fever. He did not. He had something better. A warmth that neither began nor ended with the body. "When you leave," Morag said, looking through the window at the fine line of smoke rising from the chimney, "take nothing heavy with you, Not even memories. Let them sing, and carry only one thing. Ewan looked at her. What? Morag winked, a rarity in her. The certainty that you know how to come back. Ewan tightened his hand around the cup. He felt the heat in his palm, in his wrist. He nodded. That gesture, often accused of being too simple, was enough. Sometimes the largest yeses fit inside the tilt of a chin. The last day in the valley arrived with the clarity of glass. It was not brighter than the days before. It was sharper. The outlines looked well rested. Ewan decided to walk northward, not to say goodbye, but to know one small piece of land that still lay outside the borders of his intimate map. Morag offered him a bag with oat bread, a piece of cheese, and an apple. No journey without a bite to go with it, she said, a sentence any grandmother could have spoken since the beginning of wool. The path climbed patiently. The heather moved like a small sea. A flock of geese crossed the sky in formation, making that guttural sound that seems to come from very far back in time. Ewan stopped to watch the V-shape cut through the air. He thought of lines. He thought of how sometimes the world wants only to draw lines and touch itself at certain points through them. He made a small gesture with his fingers, as though tracing something in the air. It pleased him. Halfway up the slope, he found a cairn, a pile of stones built by human hands. It was not tall. It was honest. He liked that honesty. He added a stone he found beside it, smooth, as though it had been waiting for the gesture. He laid his hand upon the cairn and said, in the tone one uses for greetings when entering a humble house, "May you endure." It might have sounded slightly wrong, or perhaps new. Morag would have said the wind understands fresh-made words if they are spoken with an open mouth. He smiled at his own awkwardness. The letters did not matter. What mattered was the gentle impulse of wishing well. The path curved toward a small hidden valley, a hollow where a stream widened into a pool. The water looked like a lamp beneath the sun. Ewan sat down, ate a piece of bread, drank from his hands, wet his forehead, closed his eyes. A bee buzzed nearby. He listened. The buzzing had the depth of song. He thought perhaps all bees practice their notes in case one night they are asked to sing with the stones. The idea amused him. He stroked the thought and let it go. Not everything has to become a story. On the way back, he took a detour that led him behind the hill of the circle. There, with that small change, he discovered a tree he had not seen before. A squat, broad oak, its branches like arms held out in offering. He stepped close, leaned his back against the trunk, and let it hold him. Trees, like stones, know the art of supporting without demanding posture. He gave silent thanks. A small bird landed nearby. It did not sing. It breathed with him for a moment, then flew away. When the sun was setting, Ewan stood at the edge of the clearing. He did not mean to go in. He had already been there. He smiled toward the stones the way one smiles at a neighbor in the morning. A greeting without conversation. The wind, however, made a gesture and invited him. It was the lightest of invitations. Ewan took a few steps forward. He stood at the side, raised a hand in greeting, and remained there listening to the last sounds of the day. The music was so low it was nearly imagination. That felt right to him. Not every day ends with applause. That night, Morag and Ewan ate in calm. They talked about the weather that had been, and the weather that would come. They chose no grand words. Sometimes they repeated themselves. It was lovely. The dog, by now accustomed to their voices, settled in a place where it could watch both of them without moving its neck. "You're leaving tomorrow," Morag said as a simple fact. Ewan nodded. There was no sadness in it. There was only the feeling of having drunk enough from that bowl, and of being able to carry the flavor on his tongue without needing the bowl itself. Morag placed her hand on the back of his. "If you lose your way on another hill, look for a ring of stones, and if there is none, sit wherever the wind first touches the tip of your ear. That will be your circle." "I will," said Ewan. As a gift, he left the handkerchief with the spiral folded by the fire. Not to get rid of it, but so the place would keep something of his as well. Morag, saying nothing, tucked it into the familiar drawer. Ewan understood that objects here move in patterns much like the wind. The next morning was a caress. The sky was high. The clouds were few. Morag slung a satchel over his shoulder. Along with bread and cheese, she had added a small jar of something dark. "Blueberry jam," she explained. "It will stain your mouth at night, and sleep will come quickly. The stones approve." Ewan laughed. They walked together to the first bend in the path. The dog decided to accompany him for 2 bends more. Then, respectfully, it returned to Morag. She raised a hand. They said no goodbye, nothing too binding. They gave each other a see you later the wind was glad to collect. Ewan walked on with long, slow heartbeats. The pack did not weigh on him. His feet knew where to go. There was no hurry. Sometimes when he reached a rise, he looked back and saw Morag's house, tiny in the distance. In those glances he left a little of his breath behind, the way one leaves water for a plant to hold it through several days. For a good stretch, he thought of nothing except stone, mist, and light. Then, as often happens on a road, ideas began to weave themselves. Not plans, ideas. Such as perhaps he might come back one day. Not tomorrow, but come back. Or perhaps on another hill, he might listen for the music of trees, or of dunes. The world, all at once, seemed full of silent instruments waiting for the wind to strike them at exactly the right angle. The first village announced itself with a smell of bread, stronger even than Morag's. Stone houses, small windows, a child with a stick, an old man in a cap. Ewan passed through quietly. He bought a loaf so as not to steal bread from the future. A cat brushed against his ankle. It kindly took some of his scent away with it. The cat, being an expert, accepted the task without pride. On a corner, pinned to a notice board, there was a map. The kind of map Ewan had used all his life. He looked at it with a faint smile. He saw lines. He saw names. He saw with affection that the stone circle was not there. It did not bother him. He touched the folded edge of the map with one finger, as though greeting it, and went on. At the edge of the village, a Bealach wind slipped between 2 mountains. Ewan recognized it by its whistle. He smiled. He blew into the hollow of his chest, just as he had been taught, very softly. The answer came at once, a tiny vibration beneath his sternum, a sustained note that lingered for a few seconds, and then was gone. It was not spectacular magic. It was a wink. That night he camped in a sheltered hollow with a birch as his companion. When the sky finally darkened, it revealed a gauze of stars. Ewan ate bread with jam. His mouth was stained a little. He laughed to himself, not out of madness, but out of company. The wind, affectionate, stirred a lock of his hair. He wrapped himself in the blanket. Before closing his eyes, he blew again into the hollow in his chest. He expected no answer at once. Even so, one came. A note as tiny as an insect. a note that said in its own language, "Sleep," and he slept. In the days that followed, the music of the stones became a secret habit. An inner bridge, in any inn, on any hill, by any lakeshore, Ewan could find the place where the wind wanted to speak. Sometimes it was a dry stone wall, sometimes the old back of a poplar tree, sometimes the shadow beneath an overturned boat on the shore. Life did not change in its great outlines. It changed in its air. What had once been weight became a kind gravity that was gentle. What had once been noise became background. What had once been incomprehension became welcome mystery. Years later, and there is no need to hurry this part of the telling, he returned to the valley. He was not older. He was more finely tuned. Morag was still there, with the dog perhaps greyer, perhaps wiser. The croft smelled of bread as always, of wool as always, and of something new every day. One afternoon they climbed together to the slope, carrying 2 cups. The stones sang under an uncertain wind. Morag closed her eyes. Ewan did too. Nothing needed saying. Before leaving again, Ewan built a small cairn at the edge of the clearing. Not to mark anything, but to let his gesture remain in time. A few nervous sparrows landed on top of it. The wind played with their feathers. Ewan left a strand of wool, pulled painlessly from his sweater, at the foot of one stone. A thank you without ceremony. The hill, in its hill-like way, watched him go. Not with eyes, with grass, with mist, with stone. It watched him and knew, the way broad things know, that there are no comings and goings once a person has learned to blow into the hollow of the chest. That everything is a form of staying. Ewan walked toward a new mist with the steps of someone carrying a song in his pocket. Somewhere, a woman lit a fire and set water to boil. Somewhere else, an old stag crossed a stream. Somewhere else, a child blew across the mouth of an empty bottle and marveled that the world answered back. High above, the stones sang whenever the wind blew. They sang for those who were present. They sang for those who were gone. They sang for the water, for the sheep, for the thrushes. They sang for the moss, holding its cold with dignity. They sang alone, without audience, on nights of snow. They sang in summer, when the clouds looked like sleeping sheep. They sang whenever the air found its doorway. And sometimes, when no one was looking, very softly, simply for the pleasure of it, they sang even without the wind.